When I decided to challenge myself with 5 new habits for just 7 days, I thought it would be simple. After all, a week isn't that long. But what I discovered was that 7 days is more than enough to feel the power of small shifts in daily behavior. These habits weren't just about discipline, they were about clarity, presence, and purpose. They reminded me that the smallest actions, repeated consistently, shape the way we see ourselves and the way we show up for others. The first habit I tried was waking up 1 hour earlier than usual. Now, this wasn't just about having more hours in the day. It was about owning the start of my day before the world claimed it. In that quiet hour, I wasn't rushing, I wasn't reacting, I was simply present. I had time to think, to reflect, and to prepare myself mentally for what lay ahead. The difference it made was not in productivity alone, but in mindset. When you start your day with intention, you don't feel like you're catching up. You feel like you're leading it. The second habit was daily journaling. At first, it felt uncomfortable. What do I even write about? But as the days went by, I realized journaling isn't about crafting perfect sentences. It's about clearing mental clutter. Writing gave me the space to process my emotions, to celebrate little wins, and to confront challenges without judgment. By the end of the week, I noticed something remarkable. I was calmer, more self-aware, and more grateful. Sometimes the act of putting thoughts on paper is the very act of letting go. The third habit was eliminating distractions for 2 hours each day. No phone, no notifications, no background noise, just deep, focused work. This habit was harder than I expected because distractions have become our default. But once I leaned into it, I experienced something rare flow. In those distraction-free hours, I accomplished more than I often do in half a day. More importantly, I learned that focus is a muscle. The more we practice it, the stronger it becomes. The fourth habit was intentional connection. Every day, I reached out to someone I cared about, not with an agenda, but simply to connect. A phone call, a message, or a short conversation face to face. These moments didn't take much time, but they reminded me that relationships don't strengthen by accident. They strengthen through attention. And what surprised me most was how those simple connections fueled me with more energy and joy than any productivity hack ever could. The fifth and final habit was daily reflection before sleep. I asked myself 3 questions each night. What did I do well today? What could I improve tomorrow? And what am I grateful for right now? These questions created a sense of closure to my day. They turned mistakes into lessons, achievements into fuel, and ordinary moments into gratitude. By the 7th night, I realized I wasn't just ending my day better. I was preparing my tomorrow with clarity. What I learned from these 7 days is this transformation doesn't require grand gestures. It requires small, deliberate choices practiced consistently. Each habit revealed a truth. When you claim your mornings, you set the tone for leadership. When you write, you free your mind. When you focus, you multiply your impact. When you connect, you create meaning. And when you reflect, you grow. 7 days was enough to prove one thing: the life we want is always built in the little things we choose to do daily. 5 keynotes of the speech: waking up earlier creates clarity and ownership of the day. Journaling builds self-awareness and emotional balance. Eliminating distractions strengthens focus and productivity. Intentional connection deepens relationships and fuels joy. Daily reflection turns experiences into growth and gratitude. Waking up earlier may sound like a simple adjustment, but the depth of its impact goes far beyond the clock. It is not just about trading sleep for productivity, it is about creating space to own the start of the day before the demands of the world rush in. When I committed to waking up 1 hour earlier than usual for 7 days, I expected to feel tired, perhaps sluggish, and I even worried I would compromise my energy. But what actually happened was transformative. That extra hour gave me something I had rarely experienced before: control over my own time without interruptions, without noise, and without the constant urgency of life pressing against me. It was a pocket of stillness, and in that stillness, I discovered the power of clarity. The first morning felt unusual. The alarm went off, and instinctively I wanted to hit snooze. But as I pushed myself out of bed and looked around, I realized the world outside my window was still quiet. The usual hum of traffic hadn't begun, my phone hadn't started buzzing, and even the sunlight was still stretching itself across the horizon. That quiet hour was mine, unclaimed by deadlines, unshaped by responsibilities, untouched by anyone else's expectations. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't racing against the day. Instead, the day was waiting for me to begin it. In that hour, I began to notice how much difference a calm start makes to the mind. Normally, mornings felt like a rush: wake up, check notifications, scramble through tasks, and already feel behind. But waking up earlier gave me the chance to pause. I could think about what mattered most for the day. I could reflect before reacting. That small shift in timing turned my mornings from a battlefield of stress into a space for preparation. And the preparation wasn't just about making to-do lists or planning tasks. It was about preparing myself mentally and emotionally to step into the day with intention rather than anxiety. As the week continued, I realized that waking up early is less about the action itself and more about the statement it makes. It is a declaration that I am choosing to lead my day instead of letting it lead me. Leadership, after all, begins with the self. If I cannot lead myself into the day with clarity and focus, how can I expect to lead in my work, in my relationships, or in the responsibilities entrusted to me? That extra hour became a training ground for self-leadership. I was no longer reactive, bouncing from one thing to another. I was proactive, starting from a place of strength. Another surprising effect was the emotional calm it brought. In the quiet of the early morning, my thoughts weren't crowded. There was no external pressure, no immediate demands, and no chaos of multitasking. In that stillness, I could hear myself more clearly. I could ask questions like, what do I really want to achieve today? Or how do I want to show up for others? These weren't questions I usually had time for once the business of the day began. But in those reflective moments, I found direction. It was as though the silence gave my mind room to breathe. It also taught me the discipline of delayed gratification. The temptation to sleep in was strong, especially on colder mornings or after a long day before. But choosing to rise early reminded me that meaningful rewards often come after initial discomfort. Sacrificing that 1 hour of sleep gave me more than I expected. It gave me peace, clarity, and a sense of mastery over my own choices. And that discipline started to spill over into other parts of my life. I was more intentional in how I used my time, more conscious about distractions, and more committed to doing what mattered instead of what was easy. What became most evident was the psychological shift. Waking up earlier didn't just give me an extra 60 minutes. It gave me momentum. Starting the day with clarity meant that the first decision I made was already a victory. That single victory in the morning shaped the tone for the entire day. I approached tasks with more energy, handled challenges with more calm, and interacted with people with more patience. It wasn't that the problems of the day disappeared, but I was better prepared to meet them. Over the course of those 7 days, I learned that waking up earlier is a habit that reflects more than discipline. It reflects ownership. It is a commitment to live deliberately, not passively. That early hour became the foundation for everything else because it reminded me that the way we begin influences the way we continue. And if the start of the day can be transformed into a space of clarity, then the rest of the day has a greater chance of being purposeful. When I first began journaling as part of this 7-day experiment, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. The idea sounded simple enough: take a pen, take a notebook, and write down what was on my mind. But simplicity does not always mean ease. On the very first day, I found myself staring at the blank page, unsure of what to write. Should I document the events of the day like a diary entry? Should I write down my goals? Or should I try to capture every stray thought in my head? The hesitation itself was revealing. It showed me how rarely I allowed myself to slow down long enough to process my own thoughts. But once I pushed past that initial discomfort, journaling began to reveal itself as something much deeper than putting words on paper. By the second day, I started to realize that journaling isn't about writing something profound. It's about creating space for honesty. Unlike conversations with others, the page does not judge. It does not interrupt. It does not criticize. It simply receives. I began writing without worrying about structure, spelling, or even sense. I wrote about what had frustrated me, what had inspired me, and what I was grateful for. In doing so, I began to notice a shift. My mind felt lighter. The act of writing was like opening a window in a crowded room and letting fresh air in. It cleared away the clutter of thoughts that had been circling in my head and gave me a sense of calm. As the days went on, journaling became less about the events I was recording and more about the clarity I was uncovering. When I wrote about challenges I faced, I began to see them differently. On paper, problems that once felt overwhelming appeared smaller, more manageable. Writing slowed down at my racing thoughts and forced me to articulate them in words. And in that process, solutions often revealed themselves. I started to realize that much of what I perceived as stress was simply noise, unorganized, unexamined emotions and worries. But once they were laid out on the page, they lost their power over me. One of the most surprising discoveries was how journaling made me more aware of the small victories I often overlooked. In the rush of life, it's easy to move from one task to another without pausing to celebrate progress. But when I sat down each day and reflected, I noticed little wins I hadn't acknowledged before. A productive meeting, a meaningful conversation, or even the discipline of completing a small task. All of these moments took on new significance when I wrote them down. They became reminders that progress is happening, even when it doesn't feel dramatic. And recognizing those small victories gave me motivation to keep moving forward. Another dimension of journaling was gratitude. I didn't set out to focus on it, but naturally, my writing gravitated toward the things I was thankful for. Some days, it was something as simple as the warmth of sunlight coming through the window, and other days it was the support of people around me. By writing these moments down, gratitude became more visible in my daily life. Instead of taking things for granted, I was actively acknowledging them. And gratitude, I realized, isn't just a feeling, it's a perspective. It shapes the way we see the world and changes the way we experience even the smallest moments. Journaling also revealed patterns in my thinking. By the 4th or 5th day, I began to notice recurring themes in what I wrote. Certain worries came up repeatedly, certain desires appeared over and over, and certain frustrations lingered. This awareness was powerful because it showed me not only what occupied my mind, but also what I needed to address. It's easy to move through life without realizing how often we circle the same thoughts. But the page does not lie. It reflects back to us the truths we may avoid. And once we see those patterns, we have a choice to keep repeating them or to make changes. Perhaps the most profound impact of journaling was the way it improved my emotional balance. On days when I felt anxious or unsettled, writing helped me release the tension. On days when I felt excited or joyful, writing allowed me to capture and savor the moment. The page became a mirror, reflecting not just what I thought, but how I felt. And in acknowledging my emotions, I was able to move through them with greater ease. I realized that journaling is not about controlling thoughts or feelings. It's about understanding them. And understanding is the first step toward growth. By the seventh day, journaling no longer felt like an exercise. It felt like a necessity. It became a quiet ritual, a daily pause that grounded me in the midst of everything else. What started as an uncomfortable task transformed into a practice of self-awareness and clarity. The notebook I once hesitated to write in became a safe space, a place where I could meet myself honestly. And in that honesty, I found a deeper sense of calm gratitude and perspective than I had expected. When I set the goal of eliminating distractions for 2 hours each day, I underestimated how difficult it would be. At first glance, 2 hours doesn't sound like much. After all, it's just a small fraction of the 24 hours we're given. But when I actually attempted it, I realized how deeply wired my mind had become to chase interruptions, to react to every buzz, ping, or fleeting thought. The moment I put my phone aside and closed all unnecessary tabs, I felt a strange restlessness. My hand itched to check messages, my attention wandered to unimportant things, and my focus kept slipping away. It was only then that I realized how much I had allowed distraction to become my default state. The first session was the hardest. Sitting with a single task in front of me felt uncomfortable, almost unnatural. It reminded me of trying to quiet a noisy room where every voice is demanding attention. But the more I resisted the urge to give in to those small temptations, the more I noticed something unexpected happening. My mind, instead of scattering across a dozen things, began to settle. The task in front of me no longer felt like a burden. It became the only thing that mattered in that moment. I was not multitasking. I was not dividing myself. I was fully engaged. And that engagement brought with it a sense of flow I hadn't felt in a long time. By the second and third days, I started to look forward to those 2 hours. They became a refuge from the constant noise of modern life. Without the distractions, I felt a deeper connection to my work, almost as though I was rediscovering what it meant to do something with care and attention. Tasks that usually dragged on for hours were completed more quickly and with greater quality. More importantly, I didn't feel drained afterward. Instead, I felt energized because focus itself is a source of energy. When you give yourself permission to dive deeply into something without interruption, you enter a rhythm that sustains you. What struck me most was the realization that distractions aren't just small interruptions. They are thieves. They steal time, yes, but they also steal presence, creativity, and momentum. Every time I broke away to check my phone or glance at something unrelated, it took me far longer than I expected to return to the same level of concentration. Those small breaks weren't harmless. They were costly. By protecting those 2 hours, I wasn't just saving time, I was protecting the quality of my attention, which is far more valuable. There was also an emotional side to this practice. At first, the absence of distractions made me uneasy, almost like I was missing out on something. But soon that unease turned into calm. I began to see that distractions had been serving as an escape from the discomfort of stillness, of facing tasks that required real effort. Once I pushed through that discomfort, I discovered the satisfaction of being fully immersed in something challenging. That satisfaction was far richer than the shallow relief I used to get from scrolling or jumping between tasks. Another lesson was how much more intentional I became with the rest of my time. Because I had carved out 2 hours of deep focus, I noticed that even outside those hours, I was more mindful of what I gave my attention to. I became more selective about when to check my phone, more conscious about limiting background noise, and more aware of when my mind was drifting. In a way, practicing focus for 2 hours trained me to extend that focus throughout the day. It was like building a muscle. The more I used it, the stronger it became. Perhaps the most surprising benefit was how this habit influenced my sense of self. When I worked without distraction, I proved to myself that I could resist the pull of constant noise. I was no longer at the mercy of every notification or passing thought. I was in control. That sense of mastery gave me confidence, not just in my work, but in myself. It reminded me that discipline is not about restriction, it's about freedom. The freedom to choose where my energy goes and the freedom to invest fully in what matters. By the end of the 7 days, those distraction-free hours had become sacred. They were no longer just about productivity, but about presence. They reminded me of the value of undivided attention in a world that constantly encourages division. They showed me that focus is not a luxury, it's a necessity for meaningful work and for peace of mind. 2 hours may not seem like much, but those 2 hours changed the way I saw the rest of my day. When I began the practice of intentional connection, I thought it would be one of the simpler habits on the list. After all, reaching out to someone I care about for a short conversation, a message, or even a quick call doesn't sound like much effort. But I soon realized that it wasn't just about the act itself. It was about the mindset behind it. It required slowing down, stepping outside of my own busy routine, and making another person the focus of my attention without expecting anything in return. That shift from routine interaction to intentional connection opened my eyes to how relationships are nurtured, not through grand gestures, but through consistent moments of presence. On the first day, I called a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. The conversation wasn't particularly long, but it carried a warmth I hadn't felt in a while. I could hear the surprise and happiness in their voice when I asked how they were doing with genuine curiosity. That call reminded me that people don't always need our solutions, they need our attention. In that small act of connection, I felt the power of being present for someone else, and it made me realize how much we underestimate the value of these moments. As the days went on, I made it a point to reach out to different people, family, friends, colleagues, and each interaction taught me something unique. With family, I realized how easy it is to assume they know we care without saying it. A simple check-in or a thoughtful question about their day made them feel seen and valued, and it deepened bonds that often get taken for granted. With friends, the conversations rekindled shared memories and created new ones. With colleagues, even a small gesture of asking how they were outside of work matters showed that relationships in professional spaces can be strengthened by genuine human care. What surprised me was how much these connections gave back to me as well. On days when I felt drained or stressed, reaching out to someone else lifted my energy. A 5-minute conversation could change the tone of my day. It was a reminder that connection is not one-sided. It nourishes both people involved. The joy in another person's voice, the gratitude in their words, or even the simple act of listening created a sense of fulfillment that no productivity hack or personal accomplishment could replace. This practice also made me reflect on how often I allow business to be an excuse for neglecting relationships. It is so easy to get consumed by tasks, deadlines, and personal goals, and to assume we will find time later to connect with the people who matter. But later often turns into weeks or months, and those connections weaken quietly in the background. Intentional connection showed me that it doesn't take much to keep relationships alive. What it takes is consistency and sincerity. A short message that says, "I was thinking about you," or "How are you doing today?" can mean more than we realize. By the 4th or 5th day, I noticed something deeper happening. These intentional moments weren't just strengthening individual relationships, they were reshaping how I showed up in all my interactions. I started listening more attentively, asking better questions, and giving people space to share without rushing them. I became more mindful of being present, even in everyday conversations. It wasn't about adding more time, it was about bringing more attention and presence to the time I was already spending with others. That shift made every connection richer and more meaningful. Another unexpected benefit was the sense of perspective it brought. In listening to others share their experiences, challenges, and joys, I was reminded that life is bigger than my own worries or goals. Hearing someone else's story often gave me insight into my own, and it created a sense of shared humanity. It reminded me that relationships are not just a source of comfort, but also a source of growth. We learn from each other, we inspire each other, and we carry each other through difficult times simply by being present. The practice of intentional connection also taught me the importance of vulnerability. Some of the most meaningful conversations I had during that week happened when I shared openly about my own struggles or hopes. That honesty created space for the other person to do the same, and those exchanges built trust in a way that surface-level conversations never could. I realized that intentional connection isn't about perfection or performance. It's about authenticity. It's about showing up as we are and allowing others to do the same. By the 7th day, I found myself looking forward to these moments of connection more than anything else. They became the highlight of my day because they reminded me of what truly matters. Work goals and achievements are important, but at the core of it all, life gains meaning through relationships. The energy, joy, and sense of belonging that come from intentional connection cannot be substituted by any personal success. They are foundational to our well-being and to the kind of impact we can have on others. When I committed to the practice of daily reflection before sleep, I wasn't sure how much of a difference it would make. At the end of a long day, the natural tendency is to collapse into rest, sometimes with thoughts still racing, sometimes with fatigue too heavy to think clearly. But instead of drifting off without processing, I made the choice each night to pause and ask myself 3 questions. What did I do well today? What could I improve tomorrow? And what am I grateful for right now? At first, it felt like a small, almost insignificant ritual. Yet as the nights passed, I began to see that this practice was reshaping not only how I ended my day, but also how I entered the next one. The first night, I struggled to answer the questions with depth. When I asked myself what I did well, my mind initially went blank. I realized I rarely take the time to acknowledge my own efforts. Even small victories like completing a task on time or offering help to someone else often slip by unnoticed. But when I forced myself to reflect, I discovered that even on ordinary days, there are moments worth appreciating. Identifying them gave me a quiet sense of pride and satisfaction that I would have otherwise overlooked. It was a reminder that progress isn't always loud. It often hides in the little things we do without giving ourselves credit. The second question, what could I improve tomorrow, opened a different door. Instead of framing the day as a series of mistakes or regrets, this question encouraged me to see challenges as opportunities. If I had been impatient, I asked myself how I might show more patience the next day. If I procrastinated, I asked how I could approach tasks with more discipline. By reframing shortcomings as lessons, I went to bed not with a weight of guilt, but with a sense of direction. It created continuity between one day and the next, turning reflection into a bridge for growth. The third question, what am I grateful for, was perhaps the most powerful. Gratitude has a way of softening even the hardest days. On nights when I felt exhausted or frustrated, Shifting my focus to something I appreciated changed the tone of my entire evening. Sometimes it was gratitude for the people in my life, sometimes for small comforts like a good meal or a quiet walk, and sometimes simply for the gift of another day. This practice reminded me that no matter how imperfect a day may feel, there is always something to be thankful for. Ending the day with gratitude created peace in my mind and lightness in my heart, making sleep more restful and the night less heavy. As the week progressed, this nightly reflection became a ritual I looked forward to. It gave my days a sense of closure, like placing a final period at the end of a sentence. Instead of carrying unfinished thoughts or unresolved emotions into sleep, I was able to release them onto the page of my mind. That release allowed me to rest more deeply. I realized that so much of our restlessness at night comes from unprocessed experiences lingering in our thoughts. Reflection became a way of tying the loose ends of the day so that I could meet the next one with clarity. What surprised me most was how this habit began to shape my behavior during the day itself. Knowing that I would reflect each night made me more conscious of my actions. I wanted to have something meaningful to write down when I asked myself what I did well. I wanted to limit the things I would have to list as areas for improvement. And I wanted to notice more moments of gratitude so that I could hold on to them later. This awareness subtly guided me toward better choices. The act of reflection at night was influencing the way I lived my days. There was also an emotional strength that came from this practice. Life often feels like a blur of activity where days blend into one another, but reflection slowed down time. It allowed me to recognize patterns, to see how I was growing, and to become more mindful of my journey. Each night was a checkpoint, a chance to realign myself with my values and intentions. In just 7 days, I began to feel more grounded and more in control of my inner world. By the end of the week, daily reflection was no longer just a small habit. It was a source of balance. It reminded me that the way we end our day is just as important as the way we begin it. While mornings set the tone, nights provide the closure that prepares us for tomorrow. In those few minutes of reflection before sleep, I wasn't just reviewing my day. I was shaping the person I wanted to become, one quiet moment at a time. When I look back at those 7 days, what stands out is not how difficult the habits were, but how profoundly simple they turned out to be. None of them required extraordinary talent or vast resources. They asked only for presence, consistency, and a willingness to pause long enough to pay attention. Waking up earlier showed me the power of owning my mornings instead of surrendering them. Journaling gave me clarity and self-awareness I didn't realize I was missing. Eliminating distractions reminded me that focus is not just about productivity, it is about protecting the quality of our attention. Intentional connection revealed how much joy and energy we gain by investing in relationships. And daily reflection before sleep taught me that growth and gratitude are built one evening at a time. Together, these 5 habits showed me a simple truth: change does not arrive through dramatic leaps, but through small, deliberate choices repeated with care. A week was enough to prove that consistency and even the smallest actions begins to shift the way we think, feel, and live. These habits may seem ordinary on their own, but woven together, they create a rhythm of living with clarity, focus, connection, and purpose. And that rhythm is what transforms days into progress and ordinary moments into a life of meaning.